complicated topic. We probably generated more questions with the information that you have received. But just recognize that knowledge is power, and this is Yachats, and we do miracles here. So we've started fighting back already, and we're getting a wonderful, wonderful base of knowledge and information about invasive plants. It was wonderful that Dr. Jepson did spend some time talking about herbicides. Our next presenter, Lisa Arkin, is Executive Director of the Oregon Toxics Alliance. She's also an educator and associate professor at the University of Oregon. As the Executive Director of the Alliance, she promotes toxic use reduction and serves as a community activist in land use planning and environmental protection. The Alliance works for all Oregonians to expose root causes of toxic pollution and help communities find solutions that protect human and environmental health. The Alliance works to systematically challenge the root causes of toxic pollution in Oregon by changing policies and laws, and provides grassroots directed action on local projects to preserve the environment and the public health of everyone.
When Wally invited me to be on this panel, I think I emailed him a couple times saying, "Are you sure a Saturday night? A Saturday night to talk about invasive weeds?" And it was true, and look at this great turnout. Not that you don't have better things to do on a Saturday night, but this shows the level of community interest. Now, I know there's a band over in the Drift Inn. We got a glimpse of them. And speaking of the Drift Inn, I think we solved the whole problem of invasive species when we were all there having dinner. We decided we should just eat them. Actually, Japanese knotweed was one of the plants we saw on our tour today. And interestingly enough, in some cultures, they are considered edible and full of, chock full actually, of things that will make us healthy, of all the plants in the world, so I read. They have the highest level of the same ingredient in red wine that's supposed to be heart healthy, and that's called resveratrol. I hope I'm saying it right. And in Japan, they make a tea. They actually grow it to make a tea. So, or we could use it for biofuel. So I think that there's a market here in Yachats. Maybe someone wants to open a new restaurant. You know. Not really. Okay. And the first time I met Dr. Jepson was on one of those trainings that he does. It was Persephone Farm, I think it was. And maybe that was a picture of Persephone Farm.
No, that was in Troutdale, that farm, actually, in the cabbage belt in Troutdale.
Yeah. It was a fascinating talk, and it really opened my eyes. It was put on by the Integrated Plant Protection Center from OSU, and I think it was the Butterfly organization, but about the benefit of introducing species that will outcompete the ones you don't want and actually be a great habitat for the kind of animals you do want. Last time I was here in Yachats was in this building, and I was the facilitator for a community forum on invasive weeds. So I'm glad to see that those efforts have actually resulted in a lot of great community work. And I know Mayor Green played a big role in finding good resolutions and or attempts at solutions. So thank you, Mayor. And I've been working on this issue for a while through Oregon Toxics Alliance. A couple of years ago, we did a study on how children were being exposed to pesticides while they were at public schools. And it was obviously, I'm a parent, and I send my kids to public school, and it was a place that I think parents assumed kids were safe. But actually, we discovered there was a significant problem with the use of pesticides at school, sometimes during the day when children were there, or in some cases using, in high school that is, using kids to apply pesticides. Yep, found some cases of that. So that resulted in a major effort at the legislature to create the school IPM, Integrated Pest Management Law, which goes into effect in 2012, and I know that faculty working with Dr. Jepson are helping to craft model programs that schools can use so that they won't be using pesticides on these campuses. They'll be using alternatives that are safe. Another project we did is working with Lane County and ODOT, Department of Transportation, to do mapping of invasive speed populations along Highway 36 so that we knew exactly where they were. And I know Dr. Jepson mentioned the value of mapping. And then we formed a team to go in and remove these invasives mechanically. That was the first season. Now we're going to go back and remove them mechanically along a 12-mile stretch and replace them with native grasses. And we were able to do 12 miles. Usually adopt a highway is 1 mile. But we could do 12 miles because we mapped it and we realized we could do it. It wasn't as bad as we thought. We didn't map it. ODOT and Lane County did. So those are examples of ways to approach the project. Doing some research, finding where the problems are, seeking alternatives. So there are some ethical issues here, and that's what I want to talk about, is the overarching framework. I'm so glad that Dr. Jepson provided you with an array of options. Sometimes we need to look at these options through a theoretical or ethical framework. And I'd like to talk about 3 different ways of looking at this today. The ecological versus agricultural model, and some of this has been touched on a little bit. Also human rights and informed consent. Maybe some of those terms are unusual for you to think of when talking about invasive weeds. And then community alternative resolution process, which actually, I think this is part of that right here tonight. So, ecological model versus agricultural model. This might be a little bit hard to read, but probably the need to get rid of weeds started as an agricultural model, the need to make sure weeds weren't interfering with crop production, and that's the vertical line that goes from invasive biology up to agricultural sciences and back. You know, let's make sure weeds are preventing us from having the kind of crop production that we want. But actually, it's so much more than that, because we are talking about a full ecological system that has many interwoven parts to it. So we need to bring in biology, sociology, ecology, climatology. I mean, why are some of these invasive plants rearing their heads, so to speak? It's because not only are some site-specific places more inviting for them and they are hardy, but some natives are not able to withstand temperature changes, and these other plants can come in and take their place. Earth sciences and animal ecology, how does wildlife interact with these plants? And then, of course, advances in the medical sciences. What happens when we choose certain ways of control, and what does that mean for humans? So this ecological framework is very important. We need to get away from thinking that a dead weed is the goal. It's not necessarily true. And I took this picture, and it was not a posed picture. I was walking home and happened to have a camera in my backpack, and we don't want to see that. Someone unsuspectingly sitting where herbicides have been sprayed. So our goals are, through an ecological model, to minimize the risk to human health, number one, and minimize the risk to native species. It has to be a realistic implementation, or we're not going to be satisfied. And I think that Dr. Jepson really hit the nail on the head when he said it might be a 10-year investment to make it realistic. We can't expect miracles overnight. For this part, after the community got together and created a pesticide-free park, and they're doing exactly what your community is doing, is signing up for park maintenance every 2 months or so to make sure that we don't have this situation ever again. So the main thing is to limit the adverse impacts of controlling the plant you don't want, as well as controlling the plant you don't want. I mean, the risk is both ways, the method as well as trying to get rid of something you don't want. This is versus maybe just a chemical solution, which might have been the standard in the past, because merely altering the landscape by killing something, by saying, it's dead, we're done, is really not addressing the underlying causes, and it's only substituting one set of problems for another. And for example, the author Pimentel in 2001 estimated that probably only about 25% of herbicides that are applied actually remain in the target area. And so that means that perhaps as much as 75% may leave the target area by runoff, by drift in the air, by revolatilization, vaporization. And that's the one thing that we have to remember is these chemicals don't stay put. They leave the site and then they're impacting other things. And this is the highway where we're doing the 12 miles of weed pulling, but you can see how close the road is to the beautiful Lake Creek, which is a tributary to the site of the river. And when chemical is sprayed there along the roadside, which as Dr. Jepson mentioned, is prime real estate for invasive weeds because it's soil that's been degraded and eroded. It's going to run right in to the river. The first time it rains, it's going to wash through soil. And that's salmon habitat. In fact, that particular river is under protective orders by the Oregon Department of Agriculture to protect the salmon in that river. It's one of those special Oregon rivers that we have. So we certainly want to make sure that in a special place like that, we're not using a chemical control. And I know that sometimes chemicals have been used here, and that might be part of the community process that you want to look at. But I look at the labels to the chemicals that were used here in the Yachats area, and each and every label did say, this product is hazardous to humans and to domestic animals. Do not allow it to enter waterways and things. So we have to use the precautionary principle. And precautionary principle, how many have heard of the precautionary principle? Okay, so I will define it because it's a small number. This is a very valuable framework for us to use. The precautionary principle tells us that even when there's scientific uncertainty, we shouldn't delay action to prevent harm. So if you're not quite sure it's going to run off into the river, but you think that it might, you have to act assuming that it will. You have to prevent harm. So we actually have a moral duty to choose a method that prevents as much harm as possible. And so that kind of gets us into the realm of human rights and informed consent. Whoever thought that the issue of getting rid of weeds might be a human rights issue, but actually everyone has the right to expect that their air will be clean, their water will be clean, the soil will be fit to grow something in, that children can sit on grass. I love the picture with the dog on the woman's lap there. You notice the dog's tethered to a tree that has been sprayed. So he runs around the tree and then jumps on her lap, which is just skin because it was summertime. And we also know, for example, so much more about what chemicals can do to humans. How many of you have heard the phrase placental barrier? Yeah, quite a bit. That's turned out to be a myth. There is no such thing as a placental barrier. A fetus is not protected by some magical bubble. Whatever the mother's exposure is, whatever her body burden is the same for that developing person. Except she might weigh 120 pounds and have a nice liver and a kidney that can process lots of things, but that developing little person does not. And the fluids and the exposures are exchanged freely. And we now know that you can detect a number of pesticides in the meconium, or the first baby poop, so to speak, that even before coming into this world children are being exposed to chemicals. So we have this moral duty to protect them. And we have a moral duty to make sure that there's not such a thing as chemical trespass, because we want to have faith. We want to trust our government, our agencies, our institution, and even our neighbors that we can keep this commitment to a healthy environment. So, the takeaway point is that the public really is demanding that we have the right not to be poisoned, and we see this coming into some of our institutional policies. Some of you may know that there's now an interagency task force, an interagency task force on toxics here in Oregon, where the whole commitment is to get agencies together to reduce toxics in the environment in Oregon. There's also an environmental justice task force that is tasked with the idea of making sure that the way we treat our environment is has justice for humans too. So I know my time is almost up. So I just want to encourage this community participation decision-making by coming together with experts such as those you're hearing today. You're going to be able to think out of the box. You're going to be able to be creative and look into regulated as well as non-regulated activities that you can address. It's going to be locally based. It's going to be site-specific to your community with the sites that we saw today. You're going to find ways to solve it. So I just want to close by saying that I want to actually close, if you don't mind, with a little quote. This was from the journal Basic and Clinical Pharmacology and Toxicology. This from an article published in 2007. And it says, given the ubiquitous exposure to many environmental chemicals, there needs to be renewed efforts to prevent harm. Prevention should not await definitive evidence of causality when delays in decision-making would lead to toxic exposures and harmful consequences. Current procedures, therefore, need to be revised to address the need to protect the most vulnerable life stages with a greater use of precautionary approaches and reducing exposures. So that's our framework for then considering all the great tools that Dr. Jepson shared with you. Keep in mind that we all have a moral, joined duty to protect one another, and especially those in our community most vulnerable. Children, elderly, those who are chemically sensitive, those whose immune systems may be compromised, and all the other things that we're not even sure, but we want to act with precaution. So we have a bill coming up in the legislature this session to hopefully strengthen Oregon's integrated protection, wait a minute, integrated
Pest management.
Pest management. Okay, and time for me to step down. So thank you very much.
It was interesting because in our tour with the panelists this afternoon, it was brought to our attention that over the next couple of years, Oregon is going to be required for very urgent reasons to produce 30% more in agriculture than it already does.
That's 30 years.
What?
30 years.
In the next 30 years? Thank you. 30% in 30 years? 30%?
Yeah, disappointingly, it's 50%.
So I'm close.
Yeah.
My numbers are close.
We have to, I'm sorry
Yes,
to
no,
interrupt,
please do this.
but nationally we have to raise the food supply by about 50% by 2050 because of the expected increase in population and decreased imports from abroad. So people like myself in leadership positions in the state and people in the federal system, that's what we're working on. It's called food security, and we think about it in terms of lack of access for people who don't earn very much. But actually it's an issue for all of us now. So
Right.
that's, yeah.
It is. And why does that have so much to do with invasive plants? Because we spend billions of dollars in lost crop production nationally from invasive species. So we know that we've got a complicated problem facing us, but we also know that to do nothing is not an option.